What's up guys, Jonny May here from Piano with Jonny. And guys, today we're gonna talk about the 10 reasons that I see classical musicians and pianists struggle to play jazz piano. All right guys, the first and probably biggest reason that I see classical pianists struggle to play jazz is because guys, it is a fundamentally different approach to play jazz than it is to play classical. So when you play classical, all of the notation is written out for you. Essentially, your job is to interpret the sheet music. The music has already essentially been composed for you. But when you play jazz piano, guys, you are essentially composing the music. You have to essentially create it. And not only that, you have to do it on the spot. This is called improvisation. So when a classical pianist sits down at the piano, they're reading Bach, they're reading Beethoven, they're interpreting the music, but a jazz musician is improvising it. They're making it up. So when you go from classical piano to jazz piano, it's almost like learning a brand new instrument because it's a totally different approach. And this leads me to reason number 2 that classical musicians struggle to play jazz, and this is because classical musicians aren't taught how to improvise. Again, they're taught how to read the notes on the page, and so when you play jazz, you have to improvise it. You have to know what to do with the chords, like a minor 7th chord in jazz. We don't play it like that, we play it like that. Okay, in dominant chords, we don't play it like that. You know how you learn in classical, you play it like that. Okay, so you need to know what to do with your chords, and then you need to know how to improvise solos. By the way, if you guys are enjoying this lesson, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new to this channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button for more videos. Alright guys, reason number 3 is that jazz technique is very different than classical technique. When you study classical piano, you learn a lot of scales and arpeggios. Okay, and these are very important if you want to play classical piano. But if you want to play jazz piano, you got to know techniques like the turn technique. Okay, this is a very different technique than what you would learn as a classical pianist, where you're, crossing over, by this very consistent pattern with scales. But in jazz, you got to have that thumb under the other fingers a lot of the time. That way you can maneuver up and down as you're creating your improvisation. Also guys, the left hand in classical music, you're going to do a lot of arpeggios, stuff like this to create your accompaniments. In jazz, you're going to use a lot more walking bass lines. Okay, and so you have to know techniques like this, and when you learn classical piano, you don't really spend a lot of time on walking bass line technique. Alright guys, reason number 4 is that jazz scales are very different than classical scales. So when you learn classical piano, you learn your major scale. Okay, and it has 7 notes in the scale, and whether you're playing a C major scale or a G major scale, it's got 7 notes in it. But guys, in jazz music, your scales are going to have more notes or less notes depending on the scale you're using. For example, a scale we use a lot on dominant chords, it's called dominant diminished. This scale has 8 notes in it. Another scale you use a lot in jazz is called the blues scale. Okay, and guys, this scale only has 6 notes in it. So when you're playing classical piano, you've got this consistent fingering among your major scales, but in jazz piano, you're gonna have very different fingering. All right guys, reason number 5 is that the chord progressions that you learn in classical piano are very different than the chord progressions you learn in jazz piano. So when you play classical piano, you're gonna learn what are called cadences, and we've got the perfect cadence, we've got the half cadence, and we've got the plagal cadence. Okay, and these are chord progressions that are used a lot in classical music. But guys, in jazz music, we've got totally different chord progressions. Like, you've got the 2-5-1 chord progression. This is one of the first progressions you learn as a jazz pianist. Okay, you've got the turnaround progression. Okay, you've got the cycle of fifths progression. You've got the blues progression. Okay, so you've got a ton of other progressions in jazz music that you don't have in classical music. Alright guys, reason number 6 that it's very hard for classical musicians to move into jazz is because the chords are very different. So in classical music, you learn a lot of major chords, okay? And they have this sort of shape to them. You learn all of your inversions of chords up and down the piano. But guys, in jazz music, your chords are gonna have a lot more clusters. Okay, these are called rootless voicings, and they have a very special kind of unique shape. And so when a classical musician first learns these chords, it's like, whoa, what are these chords? They're harder to identify at first than they are the major and minor chords. Also, guys, in classical music, when you want to play a big chord, you play big major chords. But in jazz music, you play quartal voicings. Okay, and so the underlying structure of the chord is totally different. With a big major chord, it's built in thirds, but with quartal voicings, it's built in fourths. So they look a lot different. All right, guys, reason number 7 is that when you play classical piano and you see a chord, you play it exactly as it is. C major, you'd play it like that. But guys, in jazz music, when you see a chord like a C major, you're expected to add notes to the chord to make it sound even more colorful. And so a lot of classical musicians are never taught what notes that you're supposed to add to chords. Like a major chord, you can add the 6 and the 9, and on a minor chord, you can add the 11, and on a dominant chord, you can add the sharp 11, the 13, all of these what we call extensions and alterations to chords. Also, guys, I also want to point out, when you learn classical piano, you spend a lot of time on major and minor chords, and a lot of teachers don't spend a whole lot of time on 7th chords, major 7th, minor 7th, dominant 7th chords. And guys, 7th chords are the basis of jazz. Every single tune you pull out is going to usually have 7th chords in it. So that's another big reason, which is that classical musicians don't spend enough time learning their 7th chords. All right, guys, reason number 8 that classical musicians often struggle to play jazz is because when you read jazz chords, you'll see a lot of different ways that jazz musicians will write the same chord. Whereas in classical music, a C major is basically a C major. There's only kind of one way to write it. So let me show you an example here. A C major 7th chord in jazz can be written like 4 different ways. It can be written C with a triangle 7. It can be written C MAJ 7. It can be written C MA 7. Or it can be written C with a big M and then a 7 next to it. So when you see a chord, there's a lot of different ways to write it, and that confuses a lot of classical pianists. All right, guys, reason number 9 that's hard for classical pianists to play jazz is because in classical music, again, all of the notes are written out for you on the page. A quarter note is a quarter note, an eighth note is an eighth note, and a middle C is a middle C. But guys, in jazz music, you can see a lead sheet and you can understand the chords and the melody, but getting the right feel behind the music requires a ton of listening. You've got to listen to bebop music. You've got to listen to swing music. You've got to listen to stride jazz piano. And once you've done a lot of this listening, then you start to internalize it, and you start to absorb the sound of jazz and the feeling of jazz. And this is something a lot of classical students struggle, is to get the right feel of jazz. And this is because in jazz, you gotta listen to a lot of the artists, the great pianists that have come before you. Whereas in classical piano, yes, it's very good to listen to the classical musicians play these tunes, but it's a lot easier to play the tunes without having to listen to them. All right, guys, reason number 10 that's very hard for a lot of classical musicians to move into jazz is because in classical music, you are taught to play with perfection. You're taught to be precise with your chords and your scales and executing passages. But guys, in jazz, we really focus more on the feeling and the emotion of the performance. In fact, in jazz music, it's more acceptable, I think, to make mistakes if you have a very emotional performance. All right, guys, this concludes the quick tip. And if you enjoyed this video, I want to encourage you to check out pianowithjonny.com. We have step-by-step courses in jazz music, 21 jazz swing courses, 13 cocktail jazz or jazz ballad courses, 8 Latin jazz courses. We have the blues roadmaps, and guys, we have lessons for all playing levels, beginner, intermediate, and advanced pianists. Also, be sure to check out the Piano with Jonny membership. This gives you unlimited access to all the courses, plus you get to be part of our live monthly events. And every month we do a live Q&A, we do a live workshop lesson where you can ask me questions. We do weekly challenges for the members, ear training exercises. Guys, it is the full learning platform. So go check out Piano with Jonny, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.